we will go ahead and get started. And I'm really excited that I get to do this with a longtime friend and collaborator, AJ Carl. So I will turn it over to, oh, hold on, to AJ to introduce himself as well.
It's okay, you can just skip my intro slide, Santiago, I get it. Hi everyone, I'm AJ. I am so excited to do another one of these arena trainings. I love doing these. It's honestly one of my favorite things that I do. So I live in Chicago now, but I am originally from Wisconsin, have worked in data and analytics stuff for the last 7 years now, and generally just helping campaigns and issue advocacy groups use data in better ways. And so that's a wonderful picture of me and my fiance, Catherine, and Santiago at a barn party one time.
Yeah, I always try to crash their lovely photos, but I'm Santiago Martinez, pronouns he, him, his. My background is in data. I also got my start as an organizer. And so I'm always wearing that organizer hat when I'm thinking about data and who's using data, how we're talking, really thinking about, putting myself in the shoes of organizers who are, tasked with executing on goals. So I'm always wondering, like, is this realistic for them? Trying to put myself a day in the life of an organizer to really ground the data work that I do. Also did consulting for a time. My likes are records, coffee, breakfast for dinner, which I haven't done in a long time. My dislikes are also breakfast at breakfast time. I say that just because I don't want you to think that I'm like a crazy person who doesn't like breakfast food. I'm just never there in the morning, but excited to dive in with all of you. So AJ, do we want to go over the goals for this session?
Yeah, so a few things that we want to cover. First is, I know that this might be review for a lot of people on the call, but we're just going to talk about some of the strategic framework that we like to use whenever we're thinking about how to run a data-driven campaign, just to level set with everyone. And then we want to dive into how do we actually take the objectives and the programs that we're running and relate those to our strategic plan. We want to figure out how do we use data to allocate or reallocate our resources. So like Santiago mentioned, the world looks very different than it did 6 months ago. And so how do we make adjustments to that? How do we make adjustments on what programs we're running? How do we make adjustments on our goals, where we're allocating resources? And then we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite things, which is targeting, and figuring out how do we actually talk to the best people and make sure that our programs are as efficient as possible. And then finally, I think one of the most important things that we're going to cover in this new world is how do we evaluate whether things are actually working? No one has run campaigns like this before. This is like a whole new world for everyone. So we just need to constantly be checking and is this actually working the way we thought it was going to work? So the first thing we want to talk about is how do campaigns actually think about strategy? So I like to think of this, generally I like to think of things in groups of questions. That's just the way my brain works, partially because I think I've worked with enough consultants over the years that are very prescriptive and like, this is what you need to do. You need to spend 60% of your money on this, you need to spend 20% on this, and that's the only way you can win. But every campaign is different. And so if you are asking the right questions, I really believe that you can get to a better program. There is no single right answer though. There is no thing that you do that is going to like guarantee a win. It looks different in every situation. So these three big questions that we want to talk about, it starts with people taking actions. So the first question that you have to ask yourself is, what action do we actually need people to take? Are we asking them to go and turn out and vote? Are we asking them to volunteer with us? Are we asking them to register to vote? Are we asking them to change their minds and go from supporting our opponent to supporting us? What do we actually want them to do? Because our targeting, our asks, everything from that is going to change depending on what the action is we want. Then we want to talk about, okay, I know that I want to persuade people. Now we need to figure out who are the best people that I'd actually want to persuade. Or I want to turn people out to vote. Who are the best people that I actually want to turn out to vote? Remembering that these are actual people at the end of the day. We're not trying to reach a cell phone number, or we're not trying to reach an email, or we're not trying to reach a Facebook profile. We're trying to reach a person. And so who are the people that we would actually want to get out and vote? And then finally, how do we actually do that? At the end of the day, like, how are we reaching out to them? Is a text message better than a phone call? Is talking about healthcare better than talking about the economy? Is hearing from a family member better than hearing from the campaign? Those like tactical questions, I think, have to come after figuring out what are we actually trying to do and who do we want to talk to. So there are a few actions that campaigns want people to take. I covered them a little bit before, but I think just like these 5 things are like the 5 things that you would pretty much ask a campaign to do. One is register to vote. So these are there are 3 ways that campaigns can gain votes, right? There is registration, so people who are not registered to vote, and we need to get them on the rolls. There is persuasion, people who are going to vote but aren't going to vote for us, so we need to change their mind. And then finally, turnout. We need to get people who like us but are not going to vote to turn out to vote. Those are like the 3 ways that we can get votes. There's not really any other way for us to gain and try to get to our win number. But to actually get there, we need to build some capacity. And so first we have to either recruit volunteers to get people who can actually go and make phone calls or send text messages or reach out to their family members and friends, or we need to raise money to be able to run paid programs to actually be able to send mail or buy digital ads or whatever. So we need to be able to do one of those 2 things to build the capacity to talk to voters. So if you're thinking about your program and you're thinking about, okay, I want to send text messages to people, the first question to ask is which one of these 5 things are we asking them to do? Because that universe is going to look different, that message is going to look different, depending on who you're talking to and what you actually want them to do.
So there's some key questions for planning that I want to draw us back to because it's so easy to jump right to, okay, can't do canvassing now, got to do a lot of text messages or just go out of phone calls. So I want to draw back a bit. And, you know, again, if you're a campaign manager or an organizing director, you know, trying to think about the context. What does this electorate look like? Who are the actual people who live in this district or, you know, this collection of districts if you happen to be working in a number of districts? And what are their demographics? What's the makeup of who they are? And geographically, where do they live? How can you best reach them? Geographically is a really interesting concept in terms of how we delineated work in the past. And now, because everything is moving either online or we're leaning on tactics that you know, are less site-based, we can think about this a little bit differently than we have in the past. The second question that I think is important, or second bucket of questions that it's important to think about is like, what's the state of the race now? You know, what is the environment like where all of these people live, right? How supportive, not supportive are folks who are, you know, and context I think is interesting in terms of like what's happened in the past. You know, what has happened in the last number of districts to give you kind of a perspective on like where you are now. Past election results are really, really interesting, and like what has happened in the past is really interesting right now because it can be the possibilities for what could happen in this election are just so very different because maybe you're operating in an environment where early vote has never really been much of a thing. You know, maybe that's going to be a new thing for this cycle, especially the vote by mail portion of this or the emphasis on it. And so knowing that context that's never really been a part of programs here is helpful and useful information in terms of dictating how you actually are going to run a program. And then it's also just important to think about, you know, in terms of planning, what would happen today if the election were held today and what would happen? And that gives you the ground floor of like, what does our campaign have to do in order to change that, in order to create the circumstances necessary for a win? And so that gets us to the next question of, okay, what do we need to change? Who do we need to register? Who are we persuading or trying to retain votes? And who do we need to turn out? And then the final question, because the answers to these, what do we need to change to win? That can be really big and daunting. And so we come now to what is our budget? What does our capacity permit us to actually accomplish? And what are our priorities? It's not enough to say that you need 10,000 to make up a 10,000 vote gap. if you don't have the capacity, the budget to do that. So then you have to make prioritization happen in order to actually execute a plan. And so what's that order of priorities? As more resources come in, you can be able to quickly make decisions on, okay, who are the voters that we're talking to now? Who are the next group of voters that we want to talk to? And the most important thing here is that the strategy is more important than the win number. A lot of campaigns get transfixed on this win number. And really for me, it's just, hopefully it's an exercise in, the exercise of figuring out what your win number is the process of answering some of these questions and making sure that you understand what it takes to win. And so, determining that win number, that pathway to victory is more than just the win number. And so I want to dig in a little bit in terms of like, what does the pathway to victory actually tell us? And so we know that, and this might be different if you're in a state that has a primary that's coming up in August and you're still hyper-focused on that. But generally 51% of 50% plus one in order to win. Those are all the votes that you need to win. Might be a little bit lower if there are multiple candidates involved, but this is everything that it takes to, all the voters that you're going to need to win. You don't necessarily need to talk to every single voter who is in that 51%. And so that's again where that context of like, if the election were held today, where would the race stand? Who would be voting for you? And who would be voting either for the opponent or maybe not turning out and voting at all. And so figuring out what you need to do in order to make up that difference is really important. And so who do you need to register? Who do you need to persuade? Who do you need to turn out in order to get there? And those are generally the voters that you need, that your program, that your campaign will need to be focused on. An important thing to caveat here, and I say this mostly for the organizing directors, but also the campaign managers who maybe are, go through the process of figuring out the pathway to victory or have figured out a win number and said, all right, organizing team, go do it. You're responsible for hitting all these goals. Not one program, not one campaign is responsible for making up that difference. It's a collaboration between different parts of a campaign or even other campaigns in the ecosystem to help make up that difference. And so again, something that we'll come back to again and again is what is your capacity, what is your ability, and determining this pathway to victory helps you figure out what your focus is. So for example, maybe 22% of your program is focused on registration. Maybe it's just over a quarter persuasion, and the bulk of your work is going to be turnout. And so this just kind of gives you the prioritization and the mix of like, okay, how much of my work should be this strategy versus another. And maybe at the beginning of March, you came in and thinking that like, okay, we're going to run a really big registration program, and now that's just not possible. So, there might need to be some adjustments or reallocation. Also, if you're on a down ballot race, the turnout and persuasion may not be totally mutually exclusive. There's a lot of persuasion, a lot of awareness building that you'll need to do even to a turnout universe. And so that's just something also to keep in mind. And briefly, AJ was going to go into kind of a review of the strategy versus tactics when we're thinking about how we move from those big picture numbers into implementation.
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the things that I always stress in any of these trainings is starting with that strategy rather than jumping into tactics. And what I mean by that is getting really excited about text messaging or relational organizing or like a very specific way that we're reaching out to people, knowing that, backing up and taking a higher view of the entire campaign and saying, well, who are the people we actually need to move and what action do we need them to take? And so if you take nothing else away from this presentation, hopefully you do take a little bit more, but these questions are like the things that if you have to, whenever you're asking yourself, like, how do I how do I figure out like what should I be doing right now, or what should like my text messaging program look like, or where do I start with my organizing program, or what do I do with mail? Starting with these questions helps you make better decisions and will help you kind of figure out, well, how should I allocate my resources?
And so I think it's also important to talk a little bit about who's involved in this process of overall strategy. The campaign manager will oftentimes be the overarching kind of chief strategist for a given race. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other entities, either, you know, it could be a House caucus who is a close partner with the campaign manager to develop strategy. But there's also some important questions that as we're doing that, as AJ mentioned, in terms of thinking about the strategy of like, who do we talk to? What message do we say? How do we talk to them? And so there are other players who are involved, and these can take a lot of different forms, but it could be a combination of data director. That data director might be at, you know, centralized at the party or the caucus level, but also could be an organizing director of like actually going into van and like pulling the list of who are the people we're going to go and talk to. What do we say to them? Comms director, combination of campaign manager to really figure out like what are we putting into the scripts when we are either calling people or texting people, and how do we talk to them and when. And this is a combination of all the people who you know, are executing content that is going to reach voters directly. And again, like pulling it back to what I said previously, that not one program, not one department is responsible for getting to that one number. It's a collaboration. And so if you're a campaign manager, you might be wearing some of these hats, you know, in tandem to your other roles. And so we'll talk a little bit about like, okay, how do you, especially if you're just a single person, how do you leverage maybe other campaigns that are also working in your same area, or coordinated efforts to make sure that you're kind of pulling together resources that can do that. But there are a ton of different outreach tactics that I think we all know. And again, they're all working together to reach voters directly. Some can be pinpointed, you know, directly at the right voters, and some are going to be more broadcast. But again, these are just all the different ways that we can potentially reach out to voters. And as we are thinking through each of these different tactics, we're pulling it back to the strategy of, you know, who are they? What are we saying to them? And how are we actually going to try to reach them? And so, AJ, how does this all fit together?
How does this all fit together? So we just gave you a whole bunch of information about high-level strategy stuff on a campaign. But what does this look like, especially in terms of like actually physically doing this and using some of the tools that are in the Arena Toolbox? So it all starts with that pathway to victory. It starts with how many votes do we need to win? And more specifically, like Santiago said, what programs are we actually running and who do we need to move to get there? How many votes is far less important than the strategy. Then we start to look at what resources do we actually have to execute our programs. We can say that we need to turn out 10,000 voters. We're going to do a little example of this in just a minute, but we're probably not going to have the budget or the volunteers to actually be able to turn out 10,000 voters. So what are the most effective programs that we could actually run? And then once you have that idea of, okay, I know that we can actually talk to, 3,000 voters. We're going to turn out 3,000 voters. That's our goal for our organizing program. Who are those people? At the end of the day, who are the best people that we could try to actually move? And then I think one of the most important things in this entire thing is program evaluation and reevaluating, is what we're doing working? Is what we're getting back from the field what we expected? Are we seeing some demographics are supporting us more than others than we initially thought? Or we're seeing worse contact rates with some people? And all of that then feeds back together to go back to your pathway to victory and reinforms all of these decisions again. So you can say, okay, we have more information now. Let's adjust some of our assumptions we had at the beginning. And maybe the pathway to victory doesn't change, but maybe your goals calculator changes because you got more money and got to hire another organizer. Or maybe just your targeting changes because the responses that you're getting back or a poll you got tells you that this demographic actually isn't worth targeting. So all of these things feed together in this kind of cycle, but I think that program evaluation informs all of them.
So how do campaigns allocate resources, and how do they do it across different channels? And so, I think one of the things that is just at the core of all of this is that the most basic objective is having meaningful conversations, at least one meaningful conversation with your targeted voters. And so making sure that as you are evaluating a program, it's just, are we reaching people? Are we having good conversations with them in order to get them to take those actions that we've identified that they need to take? And a question that we get again and again, and the starting place for this question is a little complicated, but we always get the question of like, how big should my universe be? Or somebody comes in kind of exasperated and saying like, my universe is 100,000 people, like I have, X amount of organizers, there's just no way, like, our goals are just like gonna be just so astronomically high. And so there's a lot of weight that comes with this question of like, how big should my targeted universes be? And so we want to dig into this a little bit just to make sure that you all feel good about this. But AJ, take it away.
Yeah, so there's two different approaches that campaigns take to this. One is starting with that pathway to victory and starting with your win number and saying, okay, my win number is, in this case, I think, so these numbers are actually based on a real district, I believe in North Carolina, that was used for the Arena Cup last time when we did the online version. And so these are like actual numbers that come from a district. There were 111,000 registered voters in that district. So our win number, assuming turnout was not going to be 100%, is 45,000 based on the pathway to victory to get to like 52% of the vote or something like that. So we're looking at that and we say, okay, but to actually get there, we need to turn out 5,000 votes. So what does that actually look like? So maybe in this scenario, campaign manager then goes to an organizing director and says, great, you are now responsible for turning out 5,000 votes with your field program. We're gonna be really, really generous here. And we're gonna say that for every time that you talk to a voter, you're increasing their chance of voting by 10%. Most experiments say that it's way lower than this, that it's actually like 3 to 5%. But we're gonna be generous in this case and say we're running the best field program ever. That still means that we need to talk to 50,000 people, which is a massive amount that we would have to talk to just to get those 5,000 votes. And now if you go even further, to talk to 50,000 people, even if we have, again, we're running a really good field program, we're talking to 20% of the people, that is 250,000, I believe. I think that my decimals got messed up. Point is, it is a much bigger number. If you go to the next one. So the universe size is like 250,000, which is double the actual number of registered voters in the district. So then we end up with, we have to talk to every voter. We have to try to attempt every voter twice to get to our number, which is not going to happen with any, I mean, no program ever has been able to do that, to talk to that many voters. It's just not going to happen. And so you end up talking to a lot of voters that you probably shouldn't talk to because you're trying to talk to everyone. Versus the way that the other option is to start with what you actually have. Start with your capacity. So maybe you know, and this is true in a field program, but it's also true with budget at the same time. If you're talking about mail or digital ads or even TV, this same thought process is how you can think through it. So using a field example though, if I have 3 organizers and I know that each of them can recruit 50 shifts per week, and that gives me 150 shifts per week. And I know that for each, we have 5 weeks left before Election Day. And so that gets us to, should be able to do that in my head, 750 shifts total. Yeah.
You got it.
And then, I know what I'm doing, data person. And so then if we know that our volunteers can knock on 50 doors per shift, this one's harder. 37,000? Yeah, 37,000 door attempts. I think I didn't do that just because I've made the slide and I had it memorized, not because I did the math. That's less impressive. So now we know that our universe size, if it's 37,000 people, we're pretty sure we're gonna be able to hit that, and we're gonna find the best 37,000 people that we can get, rather than trying to talk to literally everyone in the entire district. And we're talking to people that are strong Republicans. We're talking to people who might be like not even registered or might be dead and haven't voted in like 10 years. We're trying to talk to these people. But in this case, because we started with capacity, we can say, okay, I know exactly how many people I need to talk to. Let's go and talk to the best people. So I always highly recommend that when you get that question of how big should my universe be, start with your budget or start with your capacity as a, your organizing capacity, and work up from there rather than saying, what do we really know? What do we need to actually get at the end of the day?
Yeah, and I think another thing just to add on to that is like a lot of people will just go into Van and pull these, very kind of generic score ranges using models or past vote history or things like that. And, one, like starting from that place, you kind of skip ahead and you're, letting the data dictate who you're talking to, who you're, in a very, very broad sense, who you're talking to. Whereas here you can say, what is my capacity? Who are the right people for my organizing program to be talking to? And then you can use the data as a tool to help you figure that out and figure out who those people are and who they should be versus maybe who we're going to talk to using our paid media or our mail. And so this is a framework that I think is helpful in terms of thinking about, okay, how do you start to approach a universe, or how do I take a universe that has been given to me by the DCCC or the House Caucus, and like, how do I start trying to tackle it? AJ, hammer it home.
An attempt is not a conversation. So I think this is also really important. As we just saw in that math example, we can attempt a lot of people, but it's not actually a conversation. We're not actually talking to them. And so it's not actually as effective to attempt a really broad universe and not actually talk to a bunch of people. So thinking through, as you're thinking through, how many passes am I doing versus, how am I layering my different ways of conversation if I'm sending them a text and trying to make a phone call, and other programs are doing digital ads and mail. Not all of those things are actually going to hit the person. And so you might, if you're lucky, maybe you get 2 of those to actually make an impression on a person. But remembering that at the end of the day, the thing we want to do is not just knock on a bunch of doors or make a bunch of phone calls or send a bunch of text messages. We want to actually talk to a voter because they're a person that we're trying to get to do something. So remembering that at the end of the day, the conversation is what we care about.
But I also want to touch a little bit on adapting capacity and goals because there are a lot of campaign managers, organizing directors on this call, and maybe you've been on a campaign since the beginning of the year or March, and you set up plans and goals that are going to look very different now and into the fall, and so you're going to be very much subject to what is the timeline for voting. So I know in the next session and in some of the pre-work, figuring out what those vote by mail deadlines, whether it's requests, ballot, when the ballots actually will land in people's mailbox, returns, are all things that you're going to be thinking about. Is there in-person early voting available? And those timelines are going to impact where you allocate your goals and when you're trying to talk to, voters in a particular universe, and dictates what you might be asking them to do, what action you're trying to get them to take. There's also the capacity considerations. Maybe, you set forth and said, okay, we're going to set up capacity and we're going to be talking, really ramp up to do a lot of canvassing. And you had more than you originally, more of that than you planned now. You also might have a smaller staff. This might be a more challenging fundraising environment in some districts. And so there might be less organizing. Maybe it's just one, but that still will impact what your capacity is. There's also the need for more coordination. And so, how are you working with the other campaigns that are working in your same district is a question that you'll need to ask. And you might need capacity earlier than you expected. And so that's going to be an important thing to be thinking about because in this next slide, what we're looking at is like, we have 2 different kind of organizing ramps. This one is probably what I would say is the more traditional at the top, and maybe what your goals ramps maybe look like back in March or back in February, or what you thought it might be when you came onto the job. But just over the course of, and as you get closer to election day, many weeks out, in a traditional campaign environment, you're really building up capacity to talk to as many voters as close to election day as possible. And it's kind of referred to as a hockey stick. It just kind of exponentially goes up in capacity. And now, adjusted for all of the different vote by mail considerations or early vote deadlines, you actually might have multiple ramps. And that's going to mean that you're going to be very much subject to this calendar. And maybe when, bigger campaigns in your district are trying to talk to voters. And so knowing when, either the statewide campaign or other campaigns are talking to voters so that you can make sure that you're not talking to the same voters, that can be an issue. There's also going to be a lot of things happening at once, whether it's, phase one is going to be, we're going to be ramping up in early September to really make sure that we're increasing and getting ballot requests. And then you might flip scripts over or, based off of who's requested ballots to go into a ballot chase mode, and very much living in a scenario where starting in, 60 days out, every day is election day. And so, people who you were talking to in terms of trying to get them to return a ballot might be people that could vote that day. And so those conversations are going to be really important. And then if there's a in-person early voting component in your state and in your counties where you're working, later as we get closer to actual true election day, there might be a focus for a certain segment of the universe to vote early and in person for those people who maybe didn't get ballot requests in. And then you still might ramp up to election day, trying to get people to go and turn out in person, and trying to do that as safely as possible. And so again, just to illustrate, here's what this might, here's how this could potentially play out and how this kind of changes what your capacity needs might be earlier. And so AJ, I'm gonna go into your universe work plan document. We're just gonna walk people through a quick kind of demonstration of this. And yeah, thank you, Alexis, for doing that. But AJ, do you wanna talk through what a universe work plan even is?
This is a tool that I will give full credit to Catherine, my fiance, for creating this originally, that I have stolen many times over in the last few years. But this is a really helpful tool just to start calendaring out how are we actually talking to people across the board, and how does that overlap? And so starting at the top with these really key dates on your campaign, things like voter registration deadline, or when people are going to be receiving ballots, or when can they actually early vote, because your entire campaign is going to be built around those numbers and those dates. So it's important to know when they actually fit in. And so this is a very fancy spreadsheet that Catherine made originally, that if you enter the dates, it'll auto-create the little Gantt chart here for you and make the lines show up. Yes, you are more than welcome to make a copy of this, although, yeah, that seems to be working correctly. Okay, great. Yeah. Wanted to make sure it was not broken before we use that. So then, after you do that, you can start to then plan below. And really, I always think of this as a campaign-wide discussion of both organizing and paid, but start to think through, okay, who am I talking to? What is our target? And how am I actually going to reach them versus phones, SMS, whatever? What do those different universes look like? And when am I going to be talking to them? So you can start to get a sense of, okay, our mail program is going to start on September 1st. So maybe we should start doing text messages around that same time to those people so that we can get a sense of layering those two conversations on top of each other. So I think like having this overall view can be really, really helpful in planning out what are the phases of my campaign and when am I talking to different universes of people.
Yeah, and I know in the vote by mail section, they're gonna go through like a calendar. This is how you can really kind of calendar out and layer your universes and see how all these things come together in tandem to work. There's so many different things that can be happening at once and different voters that you might be trying to talk to or starting and stopping to talk to. So this can be a really useful tool. This is not in the toolbox. I'm glad, Rami, I'm glad you brought this up. This is a tool that will be in the toolbox, but you all get a special sneak peek of here at Arena 201. So glad you came. And so, yeah, this is, again, like you can think a little bit about both of those different programs, but you can focus on the organizing program for today, and all of the date fields and everything will populate so that you can start to calendar out. And as we get closer to election day, it'll cross out the days that have already been completed. The day that you're currently on will be highlighted in yellow. I think these are weekends highlighted in black. Is that true, AJ?
Yep. Yep.
Awesome. So that you kind of get a sense of like week to week, what are your priorities? Who are you talking to? And kind of, you know, it can get really overwhelming when you're in van and looking at just a folder or create a list with a huge checklist of potential target universes. This can help you put a little bit more context in terms of what is the actual shape of this program? What are we trying to do? So, you know, maybe originally you were planning to talk to them on the doors, but maybe now we want to, you know, run phones for early vote in person, and we want to get people to, what's the program? What are we trying to get them to do? Commit to early vote. And so you can really start to make it explicit, what's the ask, and track all of that together. The second resource is the Arena Goals ramp. This is just a copy of the capacity calculator from the Toolbox. But I wanted to walk through it here with you all, because again, it's an example of maybe you set up a plan previously for how you were going to use or divide up the shifts that you were trying to recruit in the lead up to election day. And so maybe we were going in with an assumption that 30% of our shifts would be going to calls, 60% would be onto the doors, and 10% would be phones or SMS text. And so an important thing here is like, now probably that mix is going to be totally different. How many shifts you might be able to recruit might still be the same. How many organizers you hire week over week might be different. In terms of, you know, the total here, I think is we get up to 10 organizers hired by the final weeks. That might be a lot smaller number. And so you can use the document like this to make those adjustments. And again, kind of align this ramp with your calendar, because maybe you need more organizers earlier. If you are going to be running a longer, you know, you still might have less organizers overall, but you still might need to push some of those people up to ramp up to what your goals are for getting people to chase ballots. And so, you know, you might be trying to bring on people earlier in the lead up. You might only ramp up to 8 organizers than you previously thought, but that's just definitely something to be thinking about. And then if we delete this 60% for doors knocked, the calculator is telling us that we need to reallocate that 60%. So those door shifts that you originally thought you were going to have to go somewhere. And so thinking about, can you potentially convert those over to be call shifts, SMS shifts, and making sure that you are having the ability to reallocate those elsewhere. The way that this document works is it takes the sum of all of the different attempts based off of your shifts, the attempts per shift, and we'll create, you know, here's the total number of attempts that we're going to expect, and then we'll give you a potential universe size based off of the number of passes and your contact rate that you want to do. And so that slide that AJ spoke about earlier in terms of coming at this from a capacity perspective and thinking about your universe, this document will help you do that. And so then you can go back into Van and say, okay, how do we find those right people in order to reach the number of people that we can based off of our capacity. All right, so I'm going to go back into this and we'll talk a little bit about now how we actually move from that capacity into targeting your program. So AJ, why do we target voters?
Why do we target voters?
If we had unlimited resources, we would maybe talk to more voters, or every voter. And the kind of here is like in bold. Kind of would, no, maybe not. But we would just have much more flexibility and options. And so we have unlimited resources, and so we have to prioritize. We have to think about like, who are the voters that are most important to this campaign in order, if they vote, and turn out to vote, getting them on our side.
So how do we actually target these programs? And so before you even dive into Van, before you even start looking at scores or vote history or demographics or anything, I always like to start with, if you were explaining this to someone, if you were like writing an email and someone was like, or a volunteer came up to you and said, why are we targeting these people? Why are we trying to register these people? You wouldn't say like, oh, because they have scores between like 40 and 60 on turnout and they have a support score over 80, like that's why. You'd tell it to them in like plain English. You would explain, oh, okay, if we're trying to register these people, you go to the next, then we're just trying to find people who are currently not registered and support us, right? Like the plain English version of that is, we're trying to find people who are registered and they don't support us, and do support us, sorry. Not registered and do support us. Persuasion, anyone have, we can do turnout, we can ask.
Sorry.
That's okay. Persuasion, we're just trying to find people who are gonna change their mind to support us and are likely to vote, right? For turnout, do you wanna either in the chat or do you wanna call on someone?
Ooh.
How would you describe turnout? Like, what are we trying to do when we talk about a turnout universe?
You're still like, who are the people who might support us? Who are the versus those who, are also less likely to turn out? Also, the people you identified, I think is also important. We sometimes will forget to include those people back in just because we, again, are leaning so much on those universes or scores in Van.
But I think at the end of the day, the point of this is we're trying to identify people who have specific behaviors, who are less likely to vote or are likely to support us, or aren't registered but would support us. We're not trying to find people under 25 just for the sake of finding people under 25, or we're not trying to find people who voted in the last primary just because we like people who voted in the last primary. It's because we're trying to identify who these people actually are based on their behaviors. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can do that, but I think starting with those like that framework of describe it in plain English, I think is like really helpful. And so how do we target specific universes? So one thing I always stress is don't overcomplicate your universes. They don't need to be like 30-step searches in Van. They can be pretty simple. Really, at the end of the day, the thing that you would want to do is, if you're making a different universe, it either needs to be because you're sending a different message to those people or a different ask to those people. So for example, if we're talking about vote by mail, a vote by mail application universe might look a lot different than other universes, because our actual ask for them is going to be apply to vote by mail versus asking people who have already received a ballot. Our ask is going to be go and vote and actually return your ballot. And so those need to be two very different universes, because the asks that we're giving is very different, especially if someone did not actually apply to vote by mail. We don't want to be texting them saying return your vote by mail ballot and then end up with a bunch of people confused. So then we probably have a different universe of people. Oh, my animations are out of order. That is going to stress me out. I'm very sorry. I apologize to everyone.
But
ruined the whole thing. But so we're going to have a different group of people who we're going to talk to about early voting in person, because they didn't get a vote by mail ballot. We can't tell them to go vote by mail anymore. So we need to tell them to go vote in person. And then we're going to know that some people already voted in person. And for those people who have not voted yet and didn't receive a ballot, we're going to go talk to people who and tell them to vote on election day. So having those are four different universes that have four very different asks and four very different types of people and different criteria. But at the end of the day, thinking about what are the behaviors we're trying to predict and how do they fit into what we're going to actually say to these people and what we're going to ask them to do.
I found the pointer, so I'm gonna have fun with that now.
That's pretty cool.
No, it's not. All right, AJ.
Yeah, so we're going to do a little exercise to kind of go through this. And so we have a template spreadsheet that we're going to use that is kind of laid out similar to the strategic framework that we talked about. So we're only going to work, there's like, we set this up so that you can take this home and continue to use it. Hopefully it'll be helpful. We're only going to work in like the highlighted blue cells for this, so it'll take a little less time. So first you're going to see on the left, Santiago, if you hit the next one, we're going to start with the same way we do in a strategic framework. What is the action that we're asking people to take? Like, what is the thing that we want them to do? So in our example, this is people to vote by mail, I think is my example here. What is my description of that universe? You can skip the details. That one's not highlighted. You can go back to that later to figure out how, like, what does that actually mean? But if we're just writing the description, we're going to say, okay, we want to talk to Spanish speakers who are likely to support us but aren't regular voters. And the reason why we probably want to narrow Spanish speakers is because our message is going to be different. So if you go to the next one, our ask is probably the same as other people, sign a pledge to vote, but our script is going to look different than people who are likely to speak English. And so that's a really important distinction that we need to make in creating our universes. Like, that's warranted to create two separate universes, because you probably don't want to have a bunch of people who only speak English making phone calls to people who are bilingual or might only speak Spanish, and then you're either not reaching them in the right way, or you're essentially wasting phone calls at that point because they can't actually communicate with them. So having that like separate script and that separate message can be really, really important. And then finally, after you figured out all of this, remember the last thing that you end up doing is thinking about what are the tactics? How do we actually make that happen? And thinking about how do all those tactics relate to each other? Because we might do texting and phone calling, or digital ads and mail, but it's all going to be to the same people. It's all going to be the same message. So how do we layer all those different things on top of each other?
All right. So we're going to go into the spreadsheet now. This is your bit.ly link. I want you to use the districts that you're currently working in, roughly sketch out, like AJ said, the voters that you want to target in these districts, and you get to decide, the people that you think the campaign should try to reach. What is that message that you are taking to them? So again, thinking about what that ask and script are, what method you're going to be using to reach that audience, and then give you some time to discuss with your partner as you're going through this. And so the link here, again, in there for you. Well, hopefully that gave you a good chance to have a discussion with folks and start to just kind of think about what the different turnout universes might be looking like for you all. Pop it into the chat, how it went, any takeaways, any light bulb moments. Also, just thank you throughout for all of the questions that you all have been asking. A lot of good, I was just going through them during the break, and AJ's been a superstar in terms of being able to answer those. But now we want to go through a little bit of the debrief. AJ.
Yeah.
So, yeah, take it away.
So real quick, we can just like jump through these. We have a lot of slides left in Santiago, and I want to get to them. So we're going to jump through a few of these slides. So again, thinking through the description is like very broad. If you were just in plain language, how would you describe this? And thinking through, because again, you can go into Van and create these very complex searches, but it can be overwhelming when you just go straight to create a list and then look at all the options. So if you start with like, okay, for early vote, I want to make sure that these are people who don't receive a mail ballot and who support us. And then the ask is to go vote early, or to pledge to vote early, or whatever your program looks like. So making sure that you have those types of things written out, I think is really helpful. Also, so that you don't miss people or like send the wrong message to the wrong set of people. Cool. Oh man, my animations again. I'm sorry. That's rough. That is real rough. Oh. Okay, so you wrote out these descriptions that are great. You want to find people who support us. You want to find people who rarely vote in elections. But how do we actually do that? Oh man, and these animations are out of order. Oof. Okay, so we have all these different inputs. Usually we take some time and ask people to like name all the inputs, but I don't think we have time to do that. But most people say like we use vote history, or we use party registration, or we use demographics, age, race, and gender are really helpful. All of those different things about how do we like create a target universe. Models are really helpful with this. So whenever we hear about like predictive models and scores, what does that actually mean? We put all of this data we have on people, all of their party registration, their age, race, gender, all kinds of information about their like cost of their house, and like their number of children in their household, and their estimated income, and all kinds of different variables that we don't even have access to in VAN. And we put all those together and we create a model that has a prediction of how likely a person is to do something. And so we didn't invent this. This is not like a thing that campaigns use exclusively. This started with like companies trying to predict whether or not you're going to buy something. We just adapted it to how campaigns work. So it tells you one very specific thing. It tells you the answer to one like yes or no question. Will this person vote in the upcoming election? 0 to 100, what is the % likelihood that they're going to do that? You might also get support scores that are like on a scale from 0 to 100, how likely is this person to support us? One really important thing with all of these is it is just a yes or no question. So when you think about this, if we have, go to the next little animation thing. If we have people with a score of 75, what does that actually mean? It means that if we talk to 100 people with a score of 75, we would expect 75 of them to vote, or 75 of them to support us, and 25 of them to not do that, depending on whatever that question is that we're asking at the beginning. So it's not that people with 75 are like not as strong in Democrats as people with a score of 90, or that people in the middle at 50 are independent or undecided. It's literally that if we talk to these people, we would expect 50 of them to say yes and 50 of them to say no. They could be the 50 most liberal people in the world and the 50 most conservative people in the world. We just know it's yes or no. And so usually people with scores in the middle are actually people who we just don't have a lot of information on, and it's just kind of a coin flip. We just know that there are two different options, and they are one of those two. And so the scores are really helpful for answering that very, very specific question, and for finding people who are likely to support you. Santiago is going to talk a little bit about all the models in a little bit, but just focusing on it answers that one very, very specific question. So again, just went through that. Models are probabilistic. It's a chance that someone's going to do something. It is not the strength. It is not how democratic they are. It is just the likelihood that they are a Democrat, yes or no. So real quick, I'm going to talk through this scenario. Oh, we skipped the scenario. Never mind. Yeah. Go for it, Santiago.
And so the different types of models that you might see, and again, these are all different tools that you might interact with and see in VAN. And these are core in terms of like next steps in terms of getting from that like word description to like, okay, who are the actual individuals that we would need to create a list of in VAN. You're going to see models that are related to support. And in some places, it might be specific to a candidate. You know, a lot of times at the congressional and presidential levels, like there will be candidate specific scores so that the question we're trying to answer is very much related to a specific candidate. In other places, you might just see a general partisanship or party score. How likely is this person to support Democrats? And so this is like one set of tools to be able to, again, start to narrow in, you know, especially when you're like, want to find people who are likely to support us to turn out. Those are the two types of models that you might see most often. Then there are turnout models. How likely is this person, it's answering the question of how likely is this person to vote in a general election scenario? And then also separate for primaries, because again, that action is different. It takes something different to vote in a primary where there's maybe less information about it versus the general where it's much more ubiquitous in terms of people are talking about it. There also, you might see scores for early voting relating to how likely somebody is to vote early. In-person models, vote early in-person models might also take into account locations. How close does this person live to an early vote location? And so those might be things that are considerations for the different types of universes or the different types of asks that you might be making to people. So these are the two most common categories, and it's oftentimes one or the other. It's like you're using a partisanship score or using the general turnout model score, or the early vote score. And so these are two things that are used in tandem together in the same band search, or when you're creating or pulling a list of voters to be able to do that. There are also persuasion scores if you're trying to persuade people. These persuasion scores score how likely someone is to change their mind, not how independent is this person. Kind of across the political spectrum, people can be persuaded. They might be registered Democrats, they might be registered Republicans. It's just how likely are they to change their mind or be open to changing their minds. There's also issue models that can be used for persuasion. So if you're using, say, a healthcare message, I think Liz Luna, I think somebody mentioned in the chat, maybe healthcare or something. That can be one of the scores they use to say who cares about this issue. There's also combination scores and demographics. There might be scores that indicate if somebody has kids, which I think Liz Luna actually did put in the chat, in terms of like, again, trying to narrow in on a specific audience. And then there are things related to contactability in terms of like how likely we are to actually reach this person if we call them or knock on their door.
The one other thing I'd quickly add on the model stuff is always ask for documentation on any of the models that you're using or getting. So if you're getting it from a state party or from a committee or whoever, always ask for documentation that will explain what the model is actually predicting. For example, like early vote can be kind of complicated because sometimes it's predicting whether or not you are going to early vote, just like yes or no early voting. Sometimes it's actually predicting if you are going to vote, what's the chance that you early vote, which is slightly different. And so getting that documentation to understand what is this model actually telling me? When was it created? Maybe this is like 3 years old and it is not updated for coronavirus world at all, which like early voting looks a lot different this year than it did in 2018. So having that documentation can be really, really important.
Yeah. And Duquan has a good question in terms of like, what if the score's been created for somebody else, like top of the ticket? You can kind of map out like how similar are the supporters for your like a down ballot candidate to to the top of the ticket. Are they more progressive? Are they more conservative or moderate than the top of the ticket? And you can use that as kind of a proxy to kind of how aligned are they and how much is that score going to be predictive of other people down ballot. And so that's again, that documentation, who was that model created for is really important, especially if you are going to try to adapt the use of it for a different context. And so again, and I think somebody mentioned this earlier in terms of what somebody self-reports or confirms via a script is important information that you should be tracking. And we want to make sure that we're including those positive support IDs into our future turnout program. So, maybe right now you're trying to persuade people and you've got them to a yes. Maybe you want to include them in your ballot kind of application universe, or later in Chase. You want to exclude anybody because again, the example of 75 people, people with a score of 75, 25 of those 100 conversations that you might have might be negative, based on the scores might be actually a negative. And so we want to exclude those people. So those are additional steps to add to your universes to just make sure that you're able to do that.
So we mentioned this before, but really quickly, remember that you're trying to talk to a person at the end of the day. We might have all this information on them. We might have a Facebook ID to be able to serve ads. We might have a cell phone number. We might have addresses and emails and all kinds of different things for these people. But at the end of the day, the thing we're trying to do is reach this actual individual person. So remembering that when you're doing targeting across all these different programs, you're really just trying to reach an actual person, not a phone number. So when you're thinking about all of the different things, your universes should be more or less the same across your texting program and your phone program and your mail program and your digital ads program. because we're not just trying to text people who have phone numbers and we just need more phone numbers to text. We're trying to reach these people because they're people. And so always keeping that in mind, I think, is really important.
And I think, the last important point to drill down on is in terms of, once you actually get into the field and you're contacting voters, we want to make sure that, one, we're tracking all of these different data points in band, in terms of who we're having conversations with, because again, ultimately, we want these people to take an action. And so we need to know whether or not we're having the intended effect. And so are we identifying supporters? Are we getting them to commit? And at what rates are they committing to early vote or vote by mail? And that will help us strengthen the programs, help us figure out, do we need to add additional training on the front end of, a phone bank or a text bank in order to make sure that that conversation that they're having is as high quality as possible. And again, just getting back to we want to be making sure that we're talking to the right people. How many people have we contacted? Are we prioritizing them in the right way? How does this differ from our text program? Are we having more success on the phones? Can be helpful in terms of fine tuning the final kind of steps here in the process. I think that's all we got.